the series that would become the card game empire that would be one of the very few credible threats to card game titan Magic the Gathering, would interestingly very sparsely feature its own card game. Much like the previous episode Dragon Ball, YuGiOh would also have the same interesting scenario it found itself in, where the first section of its respective series is very interesting, but isn't necessarily a great source of reference for where the series itself is heading. So, much like the Dragon Ball manga being split into Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, YuGiOh was likewise split up. Its first section is just called YuGiOh. Its second, more iconic section, which covers the bulk of the Duel Monsters anime, would be YuGiOh Duelist. And the final section, that once again very sparsely features card games, would be YuGiOh Millennium World. In fact, unless if I decide to make a supplementary episode, the first time we're going to talk about Duel Monsters in any meaningful way will be around episode 10 with YuGiOh GX. What feels like a Mandela effect for me is that YuGiOh Duelist never actually ran in Shonen Jump magazine. In fact, every YuGiOh manga, with the sole exception of YuGiOh Duelist and YuGiOh R, the questionable sequel that also follows up on the most iconic part of the series, are the only ones that didn't run in the Western version of Shonen Jump, or at least some version of Shonen Jump. But that's beyond the scope of this video. Today, we will be discussing the first 60 or so chapters simply called YuGiOh. While not necessarily exclusively focusing on card games, YuGiOh is a series about a high school boy with famously weird hair named Yugi. Yugi really loves, and I mean truly loves, card games. He lives in a game store, his grandfather is an ex-professional gambler, and his hobby is games. He's the guy who owns every single board game, but Yugi has no friends to play them with. The only company he has is a girl named Anzu that he has a crush on, the bullies that pick on him, and the ancient Millennium Puzzle, who is rumored to grant the wish of the owner when solved. As these kind of series would go, Yugi does eventually solving the Millennium Puzzle, and his wish is for friends. This ends up being exactly what he wanted and then some. While the puzzle did ultimately end up with him having a close circle of friends, including an arc where the bullies that once picked on him would be the thing that helps him solve the Millennium Puzzle, showing that Yugi had the courage to get friends the entire time. Very cutely, the more notable of the bullies is Jonochi, and in a very cute way, if you take the first character, Yu in Yugi, and Jo and Jonochi, that makes YuGiOh, meaning friendship. However, in addition to having the love interest Anzu, the best friend Jonochi, and the other guy Honda, solving the Millennium Puzzle also unleashed an ancient malevolent spirit of gaming that possesses Yugi's body in times of crisis and passes divine judgment on those who would harass Yugi and his friends. Now this sounds a little bit different from the normal basic gist of YuGiOh, but again, we are taking this in its own context in being the first 60 or so chapters. Most of this plays out in what I think Takahashi intended to be a Clark Kent mild-mannered gamer by day, and a supernatural avenger who uses his gaming prowess to stand up for the weak and fight back against bullies at night. As you may have surmised from the last episode ending clip, or the reputation that early YuGiOh has, this plays out closer to a Jekyll and Hyde situation, where the spirit of the puzzle more so possesses Yugi than just takes control, with Yugi being blissfully unaware of the actions of the spirit of the puzzle, and as far as he knows, he just blacked out with only a gut feeling of what may have transpired in the meantime, or sometimes nothing at all, just the idea that something has happened here while he was unconscious. And the something here I would best define as the spirit of the puzzle is very similar in nature to a less lofty version of Jigsaw from the Saw movies, albeit playing for the good guys. These scenarios usually play out something to the effect of Yugi and the gang, or someone close to them, have been wronged or something, and the spirit of the puzzle will ambush the ne'er-do-well that night and challenge them to a seemingly simple game. This could be as simple as a race to solve a jigsaw puzzle, air hockey, or guessing games. However, these can also be more complicated games. That seems to be Takahashi's backdoor pitch for real games, up to and including the now infamous, or just regular famous, Duel Monsters. However, these are never just normal games. The Millennium Puzzle, its primary power is being able to initiate something called a Game of Darkness, or a Shadow Game, depending on the adaptation you're reading, where a person's heart and their mettle are tested. These games always have the rules clearly explained at the beginning. However, they always carry some type of catch that make them more gruesome and dangerous otherwise, commonly whisking Yugi and the other player into a bizarre pocket dimension just for this game. Sometimes the bizarre pocket dimension is very literal, and sometimes it's a little bit more figurative. Typically for anime adaptations, they go for the more figurative. And typically these games almost always have some physical consequence, like the monster fighting game, where getting hit in the game means you're also physically hurt in real life. Or whenever Duel Monsters or a similar game does come up, typically the monsters are real now, and the loser will be killed by their own monsters. However, it's not just losing, because these are a test of your own personal resolve. So, typically there's a party that does end up cheating, and Yu-Gi-Oh!, because it's so into games, the narrative views cheating as the worst possible thing one could reasonably do. In fact, for all of Duel Monsters, the splash page for it is fair game, fair duel. The series seems to have a very, very special place of contempt for people that cheat, which is extremely ironic given the reputation that the Yu-Gi-Oh! Playing card game has. The implication for most of these games is that playing the game fairly and to its conclusion will typically not end up with you hurt too bad. And that's because the real danger in these games actually comes from what happens when you lose. Losing a game of Darkness, or cheating at one, will subject you to a penalty game. While Batsu games, or penalty games, are a very common trope in Japanese culture, this would be like the jelly bean game in Harry Potter, where one of them tastes bad, and it's a punishment for picking wrong. These would normally be much more gruesome, and would be the thing that is behind Yu-Gi-Oh's much darker reputation for the earlier sections. These would normally end in some type of disfiguration, or mental scarring, or typically just the straight-up death of the other person that played. And while most of the people that suffer a penalty game typically did have it coming, Yu-Gi-Oh!, or at least in its early sections, come off as a little bit mean-spirited. A little bit of a bully revenge fantasy, because more often than not, the people that are subject to these games are actually not quite as bad as the punishment that they received. I mean, no doubt, definitely the scumbags and the absolute scum of society, but maybe not worthy of facing an explosion to the face, or be forced to drink poison, or experiencing death without actually dying. However, as the series goes on, even in these early sections, the bad guys tend to differ in quality somewhat. This is because, as the series goes on, Yugi and the spirit of the puzzle begin to act more as one, adding some interesting complications to their relationship with other characters, now that it's a more known factor that these two people aren't just a Clark Kent and Superman, but are quite literally two people sharing a body. And in addition, as the series goes on, the bad guys begin getting more proactive with how they handle these sort of things. So, it's no longer the spirit of the puzzle showing up and dealing out some type of harsh punishment for actions, but instead villains that are instead challenging Yugi to these very high stakes games, and all he's doing is just playing by their rules, and those rules happen to be very similar to his own shadow games. Up to and including the most iconic villain of the series, Kaiba. While modern Kaiba represents the platonic ideal of what a corporate CEO is, early Kaiba is a cartoonish caricature of what a problematic gamer is, with way too much money. So petty, in fact, that instead of living his life respecting games, after losing to Yugi in a shadow game, he would instead build an amusement park that was specifically designed to kill Yugi and his friends in a series of deadly games, culminating in the VR technology, the Battle Box, that Kaiba has made that is specifically done to replicate Yugi's shadow games. In that they would bring these monsters that they played to life in the game Duel Monsters that Kaiba very specifically loves a lot, ending with the iconic Yugi summoning Exodia. There's also the enigmatic and dangerous Shadi, who first wants to turn the tables on Yugi and challenge him to a proper shadow game to see if he's truly worthy of the Millennium Puzzle, and Bakura, who in many ways serves as a mirror to Yugi. Over the series, the spirit of the puzzle cools it on how cruel his punishments are, and become more of a friend to Yugi and has independent relationships with him and all of his different friends. However, Bakura is a negative. Both of them love games, but where Bakura recognizes the threat of his Millennium item, he hid from society. And where Yugi's spirit would be an Avenger type character, that the spirit of Bakura's Millennium Ring is just angry and likes hurting people. And unlike Yugi's spirit that comes off as more of a feral Avenger, Bakura's spirit is more of a calculating, manipulative type that just enjoys causing pain. And while this is somewhat of an informed character trait, the implication is that Yugi is a type that likes games that are more of a one and done or have a toy-like quality to them, while Bakura, on the other hand, is more of a fan of long-form RPGs, leading to the actual finale of this part of YuGiOh, the Shadow RPG, where Yugi and his friends are forced to play a shadow game with the Spirit of the Ring, where all of their souls are put inside of game pieces, with the Spirit of the Puzzle needing to actually command them around. And for the anime watchers here, you actually may recognize a lot of these plot points being heavily remixed into Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters, and being reinterpreted as more of a Duel Monster-centric game and happening much later. Again, Dragon Ball and Yu-Gi-Oh! Both share the quality of having a very satisfying ending point that would actually just serve as the beginning point of something much larger. For Dragon Ball, it was Goku coming into conflict with more extraterrestrial threats, and for Yu-Gi-Oh! It would be Yugi and company coming into contact with more ancient and dangerous villains that also hold Millennium items that bring up questions about the true nature of the Spirit of the Puzzle. And in a more direct way, the transition from a culture that saw Duel Monsters as a fun and interesting game that seemed to be Kaiba's specialty specifically, to just being one of the most important parts of the world's culture and lore. But this is all a story for another day. For now, we can conclude this by saying that Takahashi has a very deep love of games as a concept, and at the risk of insulting a billion-yen enterprise, Takahashi isn't an especially talented person at making good games. The games he makes are wonky, and rest assured, Takahashi has made several different games in the pages of Yu-Gi-Oh! And still makes more mock-ups on his social media pages to this very day. However, while he may not have the mechanical or technical prowess that seemingly random jump peer Togashi Yoshihiro would express in his works Hunter x Hunter or Yu Hakusho, or the same mechanical understanding that Fukumoto's Kaiji or Gambling Emperor Zero would have, Takahashi has something very special. Something that I don't think any other person that writes manga has, and that's his deep love of games as a concept. And not only as a concept, but as a language. Chapters of Yu-Gi-Oh! Clearly explain the rules of each game they play, expecting the person at home not just to be keeping up with the game in question, but even recreating them at home. The ends of chapters would have Takahashi reflecting on his love of games, the makeshift games that he would play at school, and even had games that were entirely independent of the manga itself for people to take home and play themselves. And these would be very similar in nature to activity books that Takahashi seems to also have a very deep running passion and nostalgia for. The games, and for that matter, the players in Yu-Gi-Oh! Never have to be especially technically good, but they always succeed at two things: looking like fun and communicating their concepts by playing. These are the two things at the core of YuGiOh. A genuine passion of games and their potential as a medium and a language to connect with your fellow human being. And if all of that sounds a little bit too lofty, the final page of YuGiOh is just a short essay about Takahashi's love of games and their potential to connect people, and how he prays that YuGiOh has successfully communicated this aspect of what he loves so much. And at the risk of grossly dating this video, games did a phenomenal job of closing the gap between people when normal human connections simply weren't possible. This isn't going to be the last time we hear of Takahashi, and absolutely not the last time we're going to hear about YuGiOh on Jump Works, but in the meanwhile, here's to you, Takahashi. Next time on Shonen Jump Works, who you gonna call?
What the? That guy's got horns! That's not normal. Oh well, not gonna ruin my day.